presentation, but there's a lot more people here today, so I've been asked just to go through some of what we covered in part one. But first of all, most of you by now know the story about how Lee and I have purchased a boat in the UK and we've renamed it. But a lot of people have been asking, especially the men, have been asking, how did you convince Lee to go along with this idea? How did you convince her to buy a boat that she hasn't actually seen yet? So I thought I'd share some advice for the gentlemen in the audience. Some of you will already know this, but for those who don't, gentlemen, if you ever want to acquire an asset, whether it be a boat or a sports car, a motorcycle, a puppy, anything at all, doesn't matter what it is, all you really have to do is get her to name it. And half the job, most of the job is done by that stage. You have to be a little bit subtle about it. You have to say something along the lines of, obviously we're not going to buy one of these things, whatever it is, but just for fun, if we did, what would you call it? Hypothetically. Once she comes up with a name herself, or she comes up with a name that she's happy with, it's 90% yours. Now there is one very, very important caveat here. If she comes up with her mother's name, then that's it. Drop it straight away. Abort immediately. Move on. Admit you've been beaten and move on with the rest of your life, okay? Because it's just not worth it. You don't want to be in a situation where you're thinking that I'm going to go out to the garage and I'm going to jump on the mother-in-law and I'm going to turn her on and I'm going to go take her for a ride. That's just no. You don't want to be in a situation where you're relaxing in bed one Sunday morning, half asleep, and your mother-in-law jumps up on the bed, sits on your chest and starts licking your face, because that's wrong, all right? So if that happens, move on, but otherwise you're part of the way, you're most of the way there. So the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. Now, in the 16th centuries, and especially the last half of the 16th century, the Portuguese absolutely dominated trade to these waters where we are here, the Far East. They had some outstanding seamen and navigators like Vasco da Gama come out here, and they kept some very, very detailed information about all the areas where they traded, all the people they traded with, the harbours, the anchorages, all the reefs that they need to be concerned about. All that sort of information was kept as a state secret by the Portuguese, and no one within the Portuguese trading community was ever supposed to divulge any of that information to anyone else. And the value of the trade over here in the Far East was emphasised in 1592, when the English managed to capture the Portuguese galleon, the Madre de Deus. Now, on board, the treasure on board this 900-ton vessel was so valuable that it was actually valued at £500,000 British pounds, which was a fortune at the time, and made up almost half of what was actually in the English treasury at that time. So it was a huge boost for the English, and it gained a lot of attention around the world, and a lot of people thought, well, we need to be part of this trading in the Far East. Two Dutch gentlemen, Cornelius de Houtman and Jan van Lichthuizen. I'm sorry if you're Dutch with the pronunciation, we'll just call him Jan today. They actually were able to get in and gain some information about the trading. Houtman's brother actually worked for a cardinal in Lisbon in Portugal who was involved with the trade industry, and Dutch traders sent Houtman to Lisbon to try and find out as much information as he can. He ingratiated himself within that network and was able to gain a lot of information about the trading policies and some of the areas that were, and some of the profits that were being made. And Jan, our friend Jan, he was actually a sea captain here in the Indian Ocean, around the Indian Ocean, and ended up doing a lot of work with the Portuguese when they were too busy to do work. So he was like a contract captain for them, and he learnt a lot about all the anchorages and the people they were doing business with in this region. And he went back to Holland, and he wrote a report, a book called The Report of a Journey Through the Navigations of the Portuguese in the East. Now, it doesn't sound like much of a page turner to us, but at the time it was a massive hit, especially amongst all the big trading nations like the Spanish, the English and the Dutch. because all the Portuguese secrets were revealed, or most of the Portuguese secrets were revealed. The Portuguese considered him an absolute traitor, and they put a bounty on his head. But these two gentlemen got together in Amsterdam in 1595 and decided that they would try and take advantage of the profits being made, or the wealth in the Far East. And so they commissioned a journey. They got 4 ships, the Amsterdam, the Hollandia, the Mauritius and the Dovekin, and we'll talk about the Dovekin a little bit later on, and they took off for the Far East. The journey didn't go very well at all to begin with. By the time they got to Madagascar, 70 of the sailors on board the ships had died of scurvy already. When they got to the Banda Islands, which were known as the Spice Islands at the time, they actually went ashore, but Houtman was a very bombastic sort of man, a very arrogant sort of man, and he wasn't well liked by anyone. And he actually negotiated to buy some peppers and things in the Spice Islands, but then he decided that he'd wait until the next crop came out. Now, during that waiting period, he so upset the local chieftains that they kicked him out. They said, "No, we don't want to do any business with you. Leave and go." So they had no luck. They decided to go to Madura and try their luck there. But on the way to Madura, the flotilla was attacked by a group of pirates, and several of the sailors on board the ships were killed. Even though, when they got to Madura, even though the local populace of Madura had nothing to do with the pirate attacks, Houtman sent his men ashore and they raped and murdered several of the populace in the villages around that area. They went on to Bali. Now, by this time, the crew was just not happy at all. They wanted to go home, but they kept set sail for Bali, and during this period, one of the captains of one of the ships started making serious problems for Houtman, and that person died very suddenly, and it was thought that Houtman might have poisoned him. They got to Bali though, and they were able to purchase peppercorns from the locals there, and in large sums, and take them back. But on the way back, by this stage, the mutiny was any day. I mean, Houtman was so unpopular, the crew were in such a bad state, they'd actually had to destroy one of the ships. They had to burn the ship and distribute the crew amongst all the other 3 ships so that they had enough crew for each of these ships. The crew were being decimated so much by attacks by local tribes and by illness on board the ships. So those crew members were distributed amongst the other ships, and they set sail for home. They pulled into the island of St Helena in the Indian Ocean in the ocean off the west coast of Africa, and they weren't allowed to go ashore there to reprovision the ships. The Portuguese who had controlled St Helena at that time wouldn't allow them to shore. So by the time they actually got back to Holland, only 87 of the 249 people aboard are still alive, and they are in such poor shape that they couldn't actually berth the ships themselves. They had to get assistance. So even though this was considered a humanitarian disaster in terms of the people that were lost, it wasn't considered a trading disaster. Because of the peppercorns that they brought back, they'd actually made a small profit, and so there was light at the end of the tunnel, and the Dutch finally knew that they could make some profits out of this. At the time, so over the next 5 years, there was 6 chambers in the Netherlands at the time, all independent states and there was also a governing body, a States General, a little bit like the states of Australia or the states of the US, where we've got the separate states and we've got a central governing body as well. But these 6 states decided that they would send out ships to the Far East to try and take advantage of the trade. And over the next 5 years, about 40 ships went from Holland over to the Far East. But when they got there, they found out that they were competing against each other over there, which was driving the price of these spices up when they tried to buy them. And when they bought them back, it was driving the price of the spices the prices they were able to get right down. So the profits weren't nearly as good as what they were hoping for. So the Dutch decided, the States General decided that they would form a company, and they formed on the 20th of March 1602, so next week is the 415th anniversary of this organisation, so good excuse to have a drink. they were established with a 21-year charter um, to trade within the Far East and try and form a monopoly in that region. They were given a lot of money to do this, 6.5 million guilders, which was the equivalent of $100 million US dollars at the time. So a lot of money, a lot of resources to be able to do this. And they formed a board of directors called the Heron 17 or the Gentleman 17. And this board of directors was made up of the 6 states that had contributed to it in the proportion that they had contributed. So Amsterdam had 8 members on this board because they had put half the money in towards this venture. And Zealand had put in quarter of the money, so they had 4 members. And the other 4 member states each had 1 person. Now, some of you have just done your maths and you've worked out that that's 16, not 17. So what had happened, so that Amsterdam couldn't absolutely dominate the board, Zealand and the other 4 states or provinces or chambers, each year they would swap and have an extra person come onto the board, and they would take it in turns who that would be. So there was actually 17, and Amsterdam couldn't dominate the board. They also had some extraordinary powers. Apart from giving the financial wealth, they were also given some extraordinary powers. They had the power to raise their own military force, their own army and their navy, which helped them with driving out all competition and creating a monopoly. It also helped them negotiate treaties. It's pretty easy to negotiate a treaty with someone when you've got a rifle to the head. So they had that power. They also had the ability to wage war. And over the next 200 years, they actually involved, either started or were involved in at least 18 wars themselves. They had their own legal system, and they had the power to torture, trial, imprison and execute people with not much in the way of jurisprudence, and they could issue their own currency, and they could trade that currency. They could control the value of that currency against other currencies. And they were given the full powers to operate from the bottom of South Africa to the bottom of South America, so taking in the entire Indian Oceans and Pacific Oceans and half the world's surface. That's the actual charter that was signed. Now, there were several advantages to the Dutch government, not the actual VOC. And these included the fact that 18% of all the profits of the VOC went back to the Dutch government, which was a fortune at the time. And from that, I mean, it wasn't just the money that went back, it was also the ancillary money that was created. So the VOC needed ships, so shipbuilders had to be brought in to build those ships, and they had to get their materials from somewhere, so that was extra stimulus to the economy. And those people who were building the ships had to have somewhere to stay, and they had to have food and all that sort of thing. So that was all extra stimulus to the economy, a bit like what we call these days the sticky dollar, where the dollar keeps going around in the economy, creating more and more wealth. And over the next 100 years, the Dutch did not have interest rates above 4%, where at the time in England, interest rates were about 10%. So they were able to make huge profits, and with those profits, they were able to create an even bigger army and navy for the Netherlands, and even bring in mercenaries from other countries to fight their wars for them, and there were plenty of those as well. And so by 1648, the Netherlands were the richest country were considered the richest country in Europe. Now, the VOC is often considered to be the first multinational corporation in history. The British East India Company was actually formed in 1600, 2 years before, but only Brits could actually invest in that company, where anyone could invest in the VOC. All you needed was 3,000 guilders at the time, and many people from around Europe actually did invest, not just from the Netherlands. And 3,000 guilders, even though that was a considerable sum, there was a lot of merchants that could actually invest. And it was a good investment, because previously, if you wanted to invest in a ship or in the Far East trade, all you could do was invest in one individual ship or one individual expedition out to there. And if that ship didn't come back, you lost all your money. So to spread the risk, this was a way where you could buy shares in the entire organisation to spread your risk out. So it was the first company to actually issue and trade shares, and this is over here on the right. This is a stock certificate that was issued on the 7th of November 1623. It became the largest and most valuable corporation in the history of the world. We see down here Apple and Microsoft. Bill Gates is about to become the first trillionaire in the history of the world. It'll tick over to $1 trillion. Microsoft will tick over to $1 trillion. But if we use the same the value of the same time today, the VOC would have been worth more than 6 times the combined value of Microsoft and Apple. So a huge organisation with a huge political base and power. And it all came down to this: the spice trade. There was such huge profits in spices. They were so popular in Europe at the time that they needed it, and the people, it was not unusual. In fact, it was very, very common that the investors would receive 300%. They could sell the goods for 300 times more than what they'd purchased for back in the Spice Islands. Now, they got off to a really good start, the VOC. So less than a year after they were formed, 3 VOC ships came across the Portuguese carrack, the Santa Catarina, that was anchored just off to the east of Singapore, pretty close to where we are right now. And after a short battle, they captured the ship. They negotiated with the crew that they would spare the lives of the crew if the crew surrendered the ship, which they did. And on board was a massive fortune. There was 1,200 bales of raw silk from China, and also huge amounts of Ming porcelain from China, which was very highly desired at the time. The combined value of those two things alone was over 3.5 million guilders. So that was more than half the investment, the initial capital investment that the company had made less than 12 months before. So the shareholders were very, very happy. The Portuguese, not so happy. And that became the start of the Dutch-Portuguese War, which lasted until 1663. But even that war was an excuse for the Portuguese, for the VOC, to use their power, their own army and their own navy, to force the Portuguese and other traders out of the area. At the time, the Dutch were fighting their war of independence against Spain, and Portugal had aligned themselves with Spain. So this was an excuse for the VOC to drive out the Spanish and the Portuguese out of the trading areas and create their own monopoly for this area and become very, very profitable. In 1605, they established the first permanent base at Ambon, which is in the Spice Islands, and we'll cover that in a second. And they started to appoint governors general to the region, an overall person based in the Far East who would oversee all of the trading activities for the company. All-powerful person. So by 1669, the VOC was the richest private company in the world had ever seen. They had 150 trading ships, 40 warships. They had 50,000 employees. They had a private army of 10,000 people, very well trained and well paid soldiers. They also used mercenaries at the time as well, and they were able to give a 40% dividend to investors on their original investment. So if we could get that these days, we'd all be pretty happy. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Banda Islands, which are the Spice Islands over here. This was the only place in the world where nutmeg grew, and nutmeg was a huge profitable crop for the Dutch, taking it back to Europe. So they wanted to establish a fort there, and they decided that they'd start a Fort Nassau on one of the islands. So they sent their most senior admiral, who was probably the second most senior person behind the Governor General within the VOC, to negotiate operating this fort. Now, the Bandanese didn't get on very well with the Dutch at all. They'd already had the experience of dealing with Houtman, and he'd insulted them. They didn't like him at all. Now, but they had enjoyed dealing with the Portuguese and the English. The Portuguese and the English had actually bought them things that they could use. They bought them steel knives and cooking equipment and tools, things that they could actually use. Whereas when the Dutch came in, they said, we're going to give you these heavy materials and cloths that weren't suitable to a tropical climate. So the Bandanese weren't very happy about the Dutch the VOC establishing a fort there at all. So during the negotiations with our good friend the Admiral here, he was taken aside with 3 of these negotiators, and they were killed and beheaded. And then the Bandanese revolted and actually killed another 46 Dutch during that revolt. Other Dutchmen got back to the ships and only just survived by the skin of their teeth. And one of them was a very junior officer with the VOC by the name of Jan Coen, who would become very influential in the future. In 1610, the British also built a fort on the island of Ai. The Dutch didn't like, and that was to protect their interest, but the Dutch didn't like that idea at all. So in 1615, the Dutch attacked and drove the British out. Overnight, though, the British regrouped, and the next day they counter-attacked and took back the fort that they had built, and in the process killed 200 Dutchmen and wiped out the garrison. But the next year the Dutch came back to get revenge. They surrounded the fort and they held siege on that fort for over a month until the English ran out of ammunition. And then the English tried to negotiate a surrender, but the Dutch went in and slaughtered every man in the fort. And they renamed the fort Fort Revenge after what had happened the year before. And the British didn't get back into there for several decades later. Now, Jan Pieterszoon Coen was later in 1619. He was made the Governor General. He rose through the ranks of the VOC and was made Governor General. And he had always remembered what had happened back in the Banda Islands when he was a junior officer within the VOC. And so in 1621, he sent his troops there, and including Japanese samurai mercenaries, and they rounded up the heads of all the tribes, the head people of all the tribes, and the Japanese executed them, beheaded them, and stuck their heads on poles around the island. And then the Dutch went through, and it was one of the first instances of what we would call today ethnic cleansing, where they either killed every Bandanese they could find outright or starved them to death. And of the 15,000 Bandanese that occupied these islands, it's estimated that less than 1,000 survived this massacre over the next 12 months. Coen then split up the Banda Islands into 63 separate plantations, and he handpicked people that would go in and run those plantations on behalf of the VOC. Now, those people could only trade with the VOC. They were there to produce nutmeg and sell it to the VOC. When they were paid on the basis of what they got for the crop when it got back to Europe, so they were paid basically on consignment, and they only received, this is the hard part, 1/122th percent of the profits of that crop, which sounds like a very small amount in comparison, but they had been using slave labour. They didn't have to pay any wages or anything like that, and all these plantation owners actually made a small fortune. It was very, very profitable. There's so much money in nutmeg that they still became very, very wealthy men. So Jan Pieterszoon Coen, he was actually an accountant by trade, but also had been a very successful soldier, and he was a very, very ruthless man. He just said, one of the things he said was to spare your enemies not, which he never did, and for God is with us. He was appointed, as I said, in 1619, and he became the dominant figure, the main reason why the VOC became such a huge and dominant and profitable organisation. He convinced the Dutch government that war was necessary to produce and protect trade, but that trade was also necessary if you were to wage war. You needed the profits from this trade if you were going to fight wars and pay armies and things. So the Dutch cooperated very much with the VOC. Uh, in 1619, they used Dutch naval vessels, not VOC vessels, but Dutch naval vessels to attack what was then known as the city of the village of Jakarta in Java, and they renamed it Batavia. It's now Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia, and that's where they established their headquarters for the VOC, and it became the most important trading port in Asia, if not the world. As I said before, he was responsible for the ethnic cleansing in Banda, but he also created a huge inter-Asia trading monopoly, trading with countries all over Asia. And from the city of Batavia over here, they went off and traded with China and India and Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, all the way over to the Middle East. They even did some trading with the Japanese, and for a long time, Europeans were not allowed to set foot on Japanese soil. So the VOC actually built an artificial island off the coast outside of Nagasaki, and that's where all the trading was done with the Japanese, on this artificial island, so that no Westerner could set foot. And for a long time, they were the only organisation allowed to trade with Japan, which once again was hugely, hugely profitable for them. There was a lot of other influences they had, including the establishment of Cape Town in South Africa, and also the discovery of Australia. I was saying last night that when I was a kid and went to school, I was always taught that Captain Cook discovered Australia in 1770, but the Dutch were there in 1606. But first of all, Cape Town. Now, this was a perfect location. The Portuguese had actually found this very safe harbour at the bottom of South Africa, and they had used that as a safe haven during storms. But the Dutch, the VOC, were the very first people to establish a trading post there. And they did that in 1652. And the reason was that it was a great location for them. It was halfway between the Netherlands and the city of Batavia. So ships could pull in there and they could reprovision with food and water. They could do some repairs to the ships if necessary and give the crew some time off an R&R. If anyone was sick, they could either be replaced or nursed back to health. But to do that, in the end they decided that there were so many ships coming in, we needed to produce more food locally to provision these ships. So they brought in farmers. There was very, very good fertile soil in the region, and the local tribesmen were seen to be very, very friendly. So they brought in farmers to produce the food and the provisions that were going to be used on board these ships. But that didn't go well with the locals. Again, the locals were being forced off this fertile land into the more arid land, and that started a war between the Dutch and the local natives of the Cape area. And those rebellions were put down very, very hard by the Dutch. So in 1657, the land was given to these farmers to produce produce for the ships. But then more and more ships started coming in. So the following year, they allowed the farmers to obtain slaves, purchase slaves that mostly came from Central Africa to work on these farms, and they were integrated with the local people. And then soon after, because more and more ships were coming in, the local farmers were able to subjugate the local population and have them work on the farms virtually as slave labour again. And because they were only allowed to deal with the VOC, these farmers had a very rough life, and they passed that on to their workers. And there were some good things that the VOC did over a long period of time, but one of the really bad legacies that they left was those farmers went on to become the Boer farmers of South Africa and the Afrikaans people, and the VOC is held at least partially responsible for the apartheid regime that happened later on in South Africa. But as I said, they did some really good things, and Lee, for example, is very happy that they produced a wine industry. They took some grapes to the region and started the wine industry in South Africa. And in 1679, they completed the Castle of Good Hope, of which the city of Cape Town is built around today. They also travelled a long way and discovered, as I said, Australia, and they mapped a large part of what we knew as Australia at the time. And Tasmania down here and some of New Zealand, and we'll get to that in a second. But the first person, first European to ever step foot on the Australian coast was a Captain William Jansoon, who had been sent from Batavia to explore this region in 1605. He had actually missed the fact that there was a thing called the Torres Strait, and he thought he landed on the 26th of February 1606, and he thought that New Guinea was actually attached to Australia. He landed in the area that we now know as the Gulf of Carpentaria. He actually named the place New Zealand after his homeland, his home chamber back in the Netherlands. So for all my Kiwi friends out there, that's another thing we've beaten you at, even been called New Zealand. So how's the little brother syndrome going now? We celebrate Australia Day as on the 26th of January each year. It's a bit like the 4th of July for Americans, I suppose. And that was the date that the first fleet arrived in Sydney. But you can see that it wasn't the date of the first European. There's actually a bit of a movement in Australia at the moment to change the date of Australia Day to May the 8th. Not because it has any historical significance whatsoever, it doesn't. It's just that if you say May 8 really fast, it comes out as mate. And mate. And that's seen as very Australian for people. Personally, I'm happy with 26th of January because that's Lee's and my wedding anniversary, and we love having a public holiday every year on our anniversary. But Jansoon came back and did a second voyage and mapped a lot of the coast of what we now know as the Northern Territory and northern Western Australia. He was appointed to the Council of the Indies for his efforts, and he was awarded 1,000 guilders by the VOC for his part in the capture of 4 British ships who were in the region supporting the Javanese when Coen went to attack Jakarta and try and take on that city. And he was the